Hello and welcome to today's virtual event on inclusion of invisible and neglected disabilities, leprosy in climate change action and disaster risk reduction for a sustainable and resilient future. At the 15th session of the Conference of State Parties to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD. The side event is brought to you by the Disabled Peoples International and Sasakawa Health Foundation in partnership with Permanent Mission of Japan, Center for Disability in Development, and the National Center for Promotion of Employment for Persons with Disabilities, NCPDB. I am the Communications Manager at Disabled Peoples International. I will also be your host for the event. Before we get started, a few quick housekeeping points.
We are connected virtually. Some of you, depending on the internet connection, might experience some latency. Please respect the speaker at all times. And I would urge all our guests and panelists to kindly keep themselves on mute unless speaking. We also have a team of language interpreters. Please select show subtitle on the closed caption menu to access live captioning. To view the full transcript, please go to the link that has been provided in the chat box. We encourage participants to keep the chat box busy with their comments and also send us questions in the Q&A window. Lastly, a humble request to our speakers and panelists to please adhere to the time limit so that we're able to close the session on time. I would like to welcome all our esteemed guests. I would actually invite Arman to welcome our guests. Arman, the floor is yours.
I extend a very warm welcome to all the panelists. Dr. Shruti Mahapatra, who's a vice chair of CDPF, DPI India, and founder and director of Swabiman. Ms. Elizabeth Evitras of Hope Initiative from Nigeria. Ms. Saipur Progress from Papua New Guinea. Dr. Takaru Nehru from Sasakawa Health Foundation, Japan. Mr. Nazmul Bari, Director of Center for Disability and Development, Bangladesh. Inclusion of invisible and neglected disabilities in climate change actions and disaster risk reduction is something which completely got exposed, and we all got to see the real picture in the global south and across the world. In middle of the pandemic, when we hit by the COVID-19, the first lockdown and the second wave, we see how people who are affected by leprosy, not to mention people with disability, are the most worst affected. If you look, the poorest of the poor and the most marginalized people in the world, one would find people affected by leprosy. There are multi-layer of discrimination which the system evades. We are at a juncture where we must raise the concern, our voices, and we should ensure that none of the people with disability and people affected with leprosy are left behind. I once again welcome everybody to this very important session, the side event here. And my apologies again for not being able to be here on time. Back to you. Thank you so much.
Dr. Floyd Morris is one of the leading experts in the world on the subject of disability. He was elected to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2020. He was instrumental in the design and the passage of the Disabilities Act of Jamaica. Dr. Morris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for your gracious introduction. And I want to thank the Disabled Peoples International for extending the invitation to me, and for also teaming up with the Sasakawa Foundation to host this event. It's always my pleasure to be in the company of my brothers and sisters of Disabled Peoples International, the leading global advocate organization for persons with disabilities, and one of the institutions that has played a seminal role in terms of the accomplishments of persons with disabilities globally. This side event is very important, and I am very honored to have been extended the invitation to speak on the theme, inclusion of invisible and neglected disabilities in climate change action and disaster risk reduction for a sustainable and resilient future. This is absolutely important. The previous speaker who gave the welcome mentioned the challenges experienced by persons with disabilities during the current global pandemic with COVID-19 and how it has impacted on persons with disabilities. And I want to start my presentation by saying to my brothers and sisters with disabilities that climate change is real. There are some individuals who have proffered the argument that climate change is a figment of one's imagination. But I am certain that the melting of the ice cap in the Alaska ain't a figment of one's imagination. I am certain that the falling of snow in Texas, which has been a phenomenal event which took place 2 years ago, is not a figment of one imagination. I am certain that those tornadoes, those hurricanes that have been hitting developing countries like Caribbean and other countries in the global south, those hurricanes are not figment of one's imagination. I want us to start there to understand that climate change is a reality. When it happens, it's causing government to have to divert resources to deal with different mechanisms to bolster and protect their country and protect their economies. And oftentimes when there is diversion of resources to deal with these situations, they generally, government that is, generally cut and reduce expenditure on social services. And when they reduce expenditure on social services, vulnerable groups become victims. And one of the vulnerable groups that is further marginalized as a consequence of these actions are persons with disabilities. So you can see the direct implications that climate change has for persons with disabilities. And what is going to happen, organizations such as Persons Disabled Peoples International have to be more vigilant, have to be more strident in terms of ensuring that persons with disabilities, wherever they are not marginalized as a result of the actions of government in order to bolster their economies, bolster their societies to protect it against climate change. Instead, the approach must be one in which vulnerable groups are protected and included in whatsoever measures are being put in place to mitigate against climate change. So persons with disabilities have to be at the forefront, at the center of such plans. And one of the things that I have found happening based on my research and based on what I have seen coming out of reports at the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is that countries across the world are making an effort to improve the conditions of persons with disabilities. And you see where they are trying to put in place the various provisions of the CRPD. But there's something that I have detected in the process. Years of implementation of the charity and medical model have been deeply embedded in societies, and it shapes and fashions the attitude and beliefs towards persons with disabilities. The charity model and the medical model have been the major drivers of programs and policies for governments over the years. So the establishment of the 2006 Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities constitutes a watershed moment, a critical juncture in the historical development of persons with disabilities. And this convention comes with a new approach. It comes with the social model / human rights based approach to disability. Now, imagine a situation where 300, 500 years of experiencing the charity model and the medical model of disability. And herein comes the human rights model for disability. And countries are required to implement these provisions. And so what I have detected is that there is a conflict that is taking place in societies across the world, because persons with disabilities now are armed with their rights, because it's not like the rights weren't there before. The rights were there before, but now that the convention is in place, these rights have been reaffirmed. And so persons with disabilities have been emboldened by this, the CRPD, and are now pushing and pressing for their rights to be respected. And critical to the rights of persons with disabilities is Article 11, which speaks to the situation of risk and humanitarian emergencies, which requires that states parties must put in place measures to protect persons with disabilities in situations of risk, which include climate change action. Now, you can just imagine the tensions in society, but we will not relent in our pursuit to make sure that the rights of persons with disabilities are respected and that governments put in place the necessary protective mechanisms for persons with disabilities. And I stand solidly behind Disabled People's Organization, Disabled People's International, and any other disability organization to make sure that governments and countries across the world respect the fundamental rights of persons with disabilities and include them in whatsoever protective mechanisms are being put in place to fight against climate change. We live and abide by the foundational principle, nothing about us without us. And we recognize fully that an injustice against a person with a physical disability in India is an injustice against a person with leprosy in China. We recognize that an injustice against a person with disability in climate change prone areas of the Caribbean is an injustice against persons with disabilities in Canada. Wherever persons with disabilities are, the same challenges confront them on a daily basis. And we have to bind ourselves together, and Disabled People's International have to lead that charge so that the world can recognize that we're a force to be reckoned with. 1 billion strong can't be wrong. And people must recognize that we have rights, and these rights must be respected. I thank you very much, and I stand ready to support Disabled People's International in all its endeavors. God bless you.
Thank you, Dr. Morris, for your remarks. It's an honor and privilege having us join today. Now I would like to invite Dr. Alice Cruz to give a special message. Dr. Alice Cruz is the UN Special Rapporteur on the elimination of discrimination against persons affected by leprosy. She was external professor at the Law School of University Andina Simon Bolivar in Ecuador. She has worked with the Brazilian non-profit organization movement for the reintegration of persons affected by Hansen's disease and has served as the member of International Leprosy Association Council from 2014 to 2016. Over to you, Dr. Alice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thanks also to the DPI and SHF for this kind invitation. to attend and participate in such an important event. Excellencies, dear colleagues and fellow speakers and panelists, the more adverse effects of climate change and conflicts continue to be mostly felt by people with less political and economic capital. Still, people leading decision-making on these issues are those who suffer the lesser impact. In order to build more equitable and thus resilient societies, it is necessary to recognize that there can be no social justice without cognitive justice. A growing body of evidence has shown that community engagement is a key strategy for simultaneously preventing and responding to outbreaks and natural disasters. Communities have an accumulated and action-oriented knowledge about their territory and people, which can enhance the efficiency of states' responses to crises. Persons with disabilities are among those who face greater threats to their survival and livelihoods in the face of natural and/or human-made disasters, and they are also the ones who can better identify the risks affecting them, their needs, and contribute to solutions. Thus, the implementation of Article 11 of the CRPD is inseparable from the participatory principle that frames the entire convention. Notwithstanding, participation is often used in discourse and seldom put into practice. In order for participation to be meaningful, issues around recognition and access, as well as the barriers that hinder both, need to be prioritized. Persons affected by leprosy are still not recognized as persons with disabilities in many national legal frameworks, but also by many civil society organizations. And yet, for the consultation I just undertook to inform my next report to the General Assembly, which will focus on disability rights, 74% of the persons affected by leprosy identify themselves as persons with disabilities. There are several reasons that explain such limited recognition. Here, I would like to highlight two. Leprosy has been historically dominated by the medical professions, and people tend to look at it as a mere disease and worse, as a mere biological phenomenon. And leprosy is also mostly incident among countries of the global south, and the global narratives on disability are still largely framed by the perspectives coming from the global north. But 30% of family members of persons affected by leprosy also identify themselves as persons with disabilities, especially with psychosocial disabilities related to discrimination on the grounds of leprosy. I remind you that the convention does not offer a fixed definition on disability, speaking instead of disability as an evolving concept in its preamble. But even when recognized as being entitled to disability rights, persons affected by leprosy continue to face multiple barriers to accessing and enjoying those. Barriers which I will examine in my forthcoming report to the GA. Dear colleagues, as I move to the final year of my role as mandate holder, I wish the people-centric approach I took for implementing my mandate can take a new step forward. That is why today I have invited Ms. Suboda Galatiwawa to speak in representation of the leprosy mandate. In the same spirit, I urge states to implement with haste Guideline 14 of the Principles and Guidelines for the Elimination of Discrimination against Persons Affected by Leprosy and their family members, and NGOs to adopt such a goal as priority in their advocacy work. In order to make systemic change a reality, we must fight for a participatory citizenship that is inclusive of all people without any discrimination. I thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, ma'am, for sharing the message. This event will not be possible without the testimonies of persons who have experienced Hansen disease. Today, we have two guest speakers with us. I would like to invite Ms. Subodha Galaitiava. Ms. Galaitiava is a person who have experienced Hansen's disease. She is a final year PhD student at the University of the West of Scotland. Subodha is also working as an associate lecturer. Her PhD research aims to explore the experiences of disabled entrepreneurs in Sri Lanka. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alice Cruz, and thank you so much, DPI and SHF, for inviting me. Excellencies, colleagues, and partners. I wish to begin my speech by quoting a phrase from a wonderful woman whom I interviewed and whose life had an enormous impact on me. She said to me during our interview, "We are like flowers that grow in the forest. We revive in the forest, we die in the forest. No one knows." Today, I'm representing not only myself, but all of us who have experienced Hansen's disease and people with disabilities who are underrepresented. I was not even aware of the depth of disability studies that have been conducted all around the world. However, after my diagnosis in 2010, I stepped into a world that I had never even imagined in my dreams. I shut myself from the outside world for a very long time because of the traumatic incidents I experienced due to the disease. Further, I was afraid to speak up because I knew the backlash from our society is unbearable. And this is the ugly truth of many persons who have experienced Hansen's disease, people with disabilities, women with disabilities, and many young girls and children with disabilities. I believe that especially women who have experienced Hansen's disease suffer from triple burden. First, of being a woman in a so-called patriarchal sexist society, being labeled as leprosy, and being labeled as disabled. Throughout our history, the overarching attitude and perception towards Hansen's disease and disability have been entrenched in negativity and oppression. And people who have experienced Hansen's disease and people with disabilities frequently hidden in their homes to avoid stigma and embarrassment. The fact that I thought it only existed in the past is still the ugliest reality in many other countries. We should be ashamed of ourselves. Harmful stereotypes and traditional practices that still exist in our society, as well as personal and social discrimination, subordinate, especially women and children's social status, resulting in a severe expression of physical, sexual, and psychological violence. Religious and ideological views, cultural traditions, and misconceptions contributed to the prejudice of those who have experienced Hansen's disease. We are often left out in society and have little opportunity to participate effectively in the public realm. Social cultural barriers keep us out of the mainstream of social life and out of development. These consequences affect women excessively. We are constantly facing stigmatizing languages, isolation, separation from our families, separation from our children, no rights to basic education, no rights to have our own property, no rights to work, and no rights to participate in the community, public and social life. Women who have experienced Hansen's disease are more likely to face a greater risk of abuse, forced sterilization, sexual harassment, sexual exploitation within their homes, community, workplace, as well as society at a serious level. But unfortunately, most of these cases are hidden within our society. One testimony of my research participants shows how discrimination still operates in our society. She said to me during our interview, "My husband left me. He was so ashamed of what happened to me. My whole life changed drastically. When I first heard about this disease, I did not know what I should do My husband asked me to get out of my house. He called all my relatives, my siblings, my parents, saying that I'm not a good person and that I have cheated on him and I got this horrible disease. They said that both me and my son brought bad luck for them and that nothing worked, nothing good happened after the marriage. I was left alone with my son. I had only one suitcase with me and little money. Many believe that Hansen's disease is associated with promiscuity and constantly makes women feel disgrace, and it severely affects their dignity. And further, many experience discrimination even from healthcare professionals. We are living in a society we get blamed for our own illness and fail to recognize those who are stigmatizing and discriminating against us. Governments have failed to protect our basic human rights of us, not only in my country, but in so many other places. The global COVID-19 pandemic is worsening these inequalities and pushing us deeper into extreme poverty. As rehabilitation, drugs, personal health have been interrupted as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are more likely to trap in a never-ending cycle of poverty. It was revealed in my study due to lack of preparedness and planning, as well as inaccessible facilities, services, and transportation networks, we are more likely to be left behind. Most refugee shelters and camps are not even accessible to us. Unfortunately, our nations have failed to recognize that there's a big bridge between the written laws that are used to protect human rights and the laws that use in practice. Although there are affirmative laws that protect the rights of people who have experienced Hansen's disease and people with disabilities, the question is if these have been effectively implemented. Sure, it hasn't been implemented effectively in the Sri Lankan context, and I believe is the same in other countries. During my 1-year stay in Sri Lanka in 2017 and my fieldwork of 3 months in 2019, what I understood is that there is more and more awareness needs to be done to ensure that the fact that the disease is treatable and curable. Many who I have met still believe that Hansen's disease is incurable and they believe it transmissible. Discrediting someone's dignity, self-determination, and equality due to an illness is a violation of human rights. People who have experienced Hansen's disease and people with disabilities are valuable as everyone else and have the right to gain access to every opportunity and deserve to be treated with respect and dignity as every other human being in society. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Sivoda, for sharing your testimony. Now I would like to invite Dinesh Basnet. Mr. Basnet is the person who has experienced Hansen's disease. He is the president of International Association for Integration, Dignity, and Economic, IDEA Nepal. Mr. Basnet, over to you.
It was an honor to have this opportunity to be part of this great event organized on the occasion of the 15th session of the Conference of State Parts on the CRPD by Disabled People International and Sasaka Health Foundation. I would like to thank both of organizer, panelists, and all the attendants. My name is Dinesh Posnet, currently serving Association for IDEA Nepal as the president. I am a person with disability. This is my disability. I saw, look, caused by Hansen disease. In the February of 1998, at my right hand had a scar. After then, my neighbor and family's members thought that the snack gods placed near my house and close to the catgut plant must have been grazed. Someone must have urinated at the snack god's place. That time, there would be no toilet. Areas would be open. As a consequence, I, the grandson of the family, must have been punished by the snack god for the excretion in the place. For 5 to 6 months, my mother took me to the traditional healers and witch doctors so that my scar at the right hand earlobe, and the back of the knee will be cured. When no relief was available to me, my mother took me to October Hospital, Teaching Hospital, and Beer Hospital. Some suggest my mother to take me to Patton Clinic as I was diagnosed with the Hansen disease. My family member from the father's side, including the grandfather who was the Pradhan Pancha, that is head of the local government panchayat, and the mother side, including the grandfather, the government official were shocked. They determined the concern, the matter at school. My friends would ask with me why my complexion was growing blacker. It was the consequence of the medicine I used. I was able to keep the secret at as my grandfathers had asked me to keep the secret. I was cured. However, I could realize my right hand was inactive. My maternal also took me to the animal hospital and found that the right hand had the uh, decay bone. Dr. Mark treated me earlier. I was not afraid. This time I know the sense of Hansen disease. I was internally disturbed. I was very traumatized this time. Krishna Gimire, the counselor at Anandan Hospital, helped me to away with all the terror. I have partially deformity at my right hand when I already saw. She suggested me to study community medical assistant course. I was financially supported by Nepal Leprosy Relief Organization partially. Later on, I got a job at Shanti Seva in 2002 AD. I studied bachelor degree and diploma in pharmacy. Now I have been working at Nepal Orthopedic Hospital as pharmacist. I have also done master degree in sociology and political science. In 2020, I was elected as the central president of IDEA Nepal. Through this realistic narrative of my life, especially the Hansen disease, the basic of my commitment, I was born at a location so close to the urban area of Kathmandu. My grandparents were educated. Even then, I was traumatized so much. The people at the rural location of Nepal cases. That's why I seriously commit to this field. The trauma that I had to face had been really terrible. Currently, Central President of IDEA Nepal. That this disease as the discrimination to the affected must be ended sooner than the later. Now, I am living in Bhaktapur district in Kathmandu Valley with a beautiful family, my loving and caring mother, beautiful wife, and son study in class grade 4. And bad news for me, I lost my father 4 months ago. At lastly, various leader position of IDEA Nepal in the past have considerable well when it comes to the help to the people affected by Hansen disease. We, the team here in IDEA Nepal, is wonderful and doing better in all respect. We promise that we shall be more committed to serve as volunteer for the better quality of life of the people with disability, especially people are affected by leprosy, by contributing towards zero transmission, zero discrimination, and zero disability. I am again thankful to the organizer for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you all. Have a wonderful time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dinesh Patel. The words of our guest speakers indeed prompt some important questions for us to ponder. A quick round of introduction to our panelists. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shruti Mahapatra. Dr. Mahapatra is a crusader for disability rights and a regular TEDx speaker. She is the Vice Chairperson, DPI India, and founder and CEO, Swabiman. She is also the Vice President of Commonwealth Disabilities. Ms. Pose, who headed the PNG Assembly of Disabled Persons in 2019 to 2018. She was instrumental in seeing the PNG government rectifying the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability in 2013, making PNG the 136th country to rectify the UN CRPD. She also was instrumental in leading on the advocacy towards the PNG government to develop a standalone disability bill and a draft being finalized to be presented to the PNG National Executive Council by the Department for Community Development, Dr. Takahiro Nandri. Dr. Takahiro is the Executive Director, Sasakawa Health Foundation. His areas of expertise is in the community development, public participation, management of non-profit organization, etc. He currently serves as the Vice Chairperson of the Global Partnership for Zero Leprosy, steering committee member of Japan Alliance on Global Neglected Tropical Disease, board member of Japan Society of Social Design Studies, etc. Dr. Nazrul Bari. Mr. Bari has over 25 years of experience in disability inclusive development. He is the director of the Center for Disability in Development, Bangladesh. He represents CDD as one of the 7 founding member organizations of the Disability Inclusive Disaster Risk Reduction Network. Unfortunately, Ms. Lilibeth could not attend the session today due to connectivity issues. Before I start, I would like to request our panelists to please adhere to the 7-minute time. Now diving right into the panel session, I would call upon Dr. Shruti Mahapatra to please present on the topic. Floor is yours, ma'am.
Remind me when it's 6 minutes, please do remind me.
Sure, ma'am, sure.
Good evening. It has been very interesting to hear such amazing speakers talking about different facets of leprosy affected people, real life experiences, and also how passionately they were talking about going ahead and changing the world for themselves and for fellow people with disabilities. I would like to tell you that in 2006, when the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities came into effect, immediately governments across the world started changing their laws, their schemes, their policies, and everything was done as rights on the rights mode. So this paradigm shift was brought about by the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disability. So things started happening. And then came in 2015, the 2030 agenda, and with its tagline, which says, leave no one behind, with 5 of its goals emphasizing on the word inclusive, and a number of targets and indicators for ensuring that the disadvantaged groups, including those with disabilities, are not left behind, international development progressed. But then 2 world events happened. In 2018, United Nations came out with its first report on disability and development. And this report showed that despite the convention, despite its country being very progressive, having ratified the convention, changing their domestic laws, the condition of people with disabilities was no good. It was far below the basic minimum which was needed either to remain hunger-free or to achieve basic literacy. In 2020 came COVID-19 pandemic. This again brought to the fore how the services that were being provided to people with disabilities had too many faults, too many gaps. The immediate decision, without consulting anyone, to conduct an overnight lockdown or shutdown, it amply illustrated that the needs, the unique needs of people with disabilities were not in the vision or eyesight of our policymakers and planners. So different groups of different categories of people with disabilities suffered in many unique ways. And among people with disabilities, there were many groups which are further disadvantaged. And one of these were people who were affected by leprosy, and their suffering was far more. But there is an opportunity. We are all globally We are all in one voice talking about building back better. So when we are thinking of building back better, then we are thinking of a sustainable planet. So this is an opportunity to understand what are our strengths, how we can build, what are our concerns we should keep in mind, and how we can move forward. So first, let us understand the impact of COVID-19 on people who are affected with leprosy. So the increasing burden of COVID-19 accompanied by travel restrictions, lockdown measures, and restrictions on social gatherings, it disrupted the lives of leprosy affected. The first 48 to 72 hours, they were famished, they were afraid, and they were completely desolate. During the COVID-19 crisis, we all know that small businesses suffered, people lost their job. As a result, but they did not have much savings. Third is the people who lived in marginalized communities, like in leprosy settlements, or they were in villages with high numbers of cases of lymphatic filariasis. There, these people could not access health services or COVID services such as the relief distribution, the food distributions. There was an increased and additional health crisis which was brought about by the hospital priority for COVID-19. So what do we mean by hospital priority for COVID-19? It means whatever resources countries had, they directed it towards the protection of people who were suffering from the COVID-19 infection, how to do the testings, how to bring about vaccines, how to ensure that precious lives were not lost. But in this process, what happened? Large segments of people with disabilities who required regular therapy, who required different kinds of medical information, talking about the leprosy affected, who needed medicines, who needed dressings, they were all marginalized. In leprosy settlements, doctors did not visit, though very quickly satellite clinics were established to look at immediate medical emergency, but medical personnel were scarce.
Sorry to interrupt, just a minute.
You can take 2 minutes.
Yeah, and the other health crisis was it because of this screening of new cases was not done. And if we look at April to September 2019 and April to September 2022, there was a 62.5% fall in the detection of cases and a 20% rise in grade 2 disability. Now, how can we build back better? Number one, we must understand it is a huge population. Second, countries of the Southeast Asian region, they constitute 71% of the new globally detected cases. And India and Indonesia together contribute 92%. I mean, they bear 92% of this burden. It is a poor population. It is a high-risk population. So high risk, why? Because they are more susceptible to contracting the virus. Second, they experience more severe symptoms, which leads to elevated levels of death. Third, we need to embrace accessibility and we need to change our attitude. I don't need to speak much, but the picture that I have in front of you, it can show you how we build ramps. And when we ask for something with a smoother gradient, we are said we are troubled people, we are asking for too much. Finally, all of us together can only change this situation. How? We have to strengthen country ownership with domestic fundraising. It has to be a joint effort, government, donors, multilateral agencies, NGOs, DPOs, and local organizations. And coming to my last slide, we know these are our pillars of strength. COVID-19, it provided us, helped us to strengthen our digital health initiatives. Excellent. Remote areas, we don't have doctors. At least people can consult medical personnel digitally. In the Hugo framework mentioned disability for the first time. And if we go down to the Sendai framework, which is the most important framework for disaster risk reduction, it is very clear and it has very clearly made reference to people with disability, saying that disabled people must be involved in the planning and design stages. Only then we can have very resilient structure to take care of all the 4 stages of a crisis: rescue, relief, rehabilitation, and restoration. And the most important thing now is the DIDRR, that is Disability Inclusive Disaster Risk Reduction. Tools have been developed. We have to work on it. We have to involve a large number of people living in the local areas. Unless we involve them and understand their requirements, resilient, sustainable disaster risk reduction cannot be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful presentation. I would like to thank our lively audience and for their comments in the chat box. I would also like to request our audience to please drop their questions for our speaker and panelists in the Q&A box. We are mindful of the time as we need to end the session by 7:15 p.m. IST. Moving on, I would like to call upon Ms. Ipul Poase, coming from an island country and as a woman with disability. Over to you, ma'am.
All right. Can I have my PowerPoint presentation, please?
Yes, it's visible.
Thank you.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, DPI International and Sawaka Health Foundation for giving me this opportunity to speak on my experience as a person with disabilities living in an island state in the Pacific. Now, what I am actually going to present to you is pictures of me as a person with disabilities, going back to my community and seeing the devastation that the climate change has impacted on my communities, but also how it has impacted me as a person with disabilities. So let me just go through. The first picture is me and my son going home to my island home. For the last 13 years, I have not been home, and I was so excited to go home. The second one. So this is my son on a boat. We travel by sea, and we're going back to the village. We can see, inside this our village. Third one. Now, the reason I'm going home is to see my family and my mother. But this is what I saw when I actually entered my village after 15 years away from home. The devastation that climate change has had. The shoreline has eroded. And it was difficult for me trying to maneuver myself. So in the villages, this is a church that I go to, but I cannot be able to attend this church. The devastation that the king tide has had on my island, my food security source is being affected. And the last slide shows, this is a well that my mother would go and get water from, but it's inundated with salt water. And so, and this is the last picture that I showed. Now, this is paradise for me, lost, turned upside down for me. And so when I look back at the topic that we are discussing now, if you go into a lot of our communities in the villages, there are so many people with disabilities that are affected with different types of disability. Now, as I took on the leadership in my country, and as I ponder upon the topic of discussion today, I am ashamed also of myself as a leader, that we have not gone out to look for different forms of disabilities that we would like to advocate for so that they can come out. When I look at the movements around the world, it is true the voices and the collective voices of different types of disabilities. And I'd like to challenge ourselves here as leaders, leading the movements in our various organizations. We know the effects of climate change. We know the effects of human rights issues, and it's the same all over. But when we really look at within ourselves the different types of disabilities, there are very invisible type of disabilities that we are not bringing out to the fore. And so when we are discussing here, I look at myself and I said, I'm a leader, but what am I doing in terms of going out and voicing searching and bringing out those type of disabilities. So in this presentations, I thought that I'd like to encourage each one of us as leaders within the disability movement, within our various countries, that we need to look out for those type of disabilities we are not reaching out to come out. You know, with people affected by leprosy in my country, we don't have this group of, we don't have voices of this group of people, but they are people with disabilities that are being affected. Whilst we discuss about, you know, the disadvantage, the issues that we face, but this cannot come out if we don't have these collective voices. And so I just want to leave, and I'd like to encourage that each of us as leaders, we really need to go out. And for me, leading the movement in the country, this is something that has challenged me, and I'd like to take on this mantle to make sure that there are voices, invisible voices of people with invisible disabilities, that we really need to go out and bring their voices up to the fore as well, so that governments can recognize that these are people with disabilities. So I'd like to leave my discussions at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Vipul, for sharing your story and experience. We will now hear the perspective of supporting countries on the topic. I would like to call upon Dr. Takahiro Nandi to share his remarks. The floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for your introduction. I'm Taka Nandi, the Executive Director of Sasakawa Health Foundation. As some of you may know, the Sasakawa Health Foundation has been working on the leprosy since its establishment for the past half century. So I mainly talk about the leprosy today. I know that time is running out, so my presentation should not be so long, because I want to contribute for the facilitator to keep the time. So anyway, there are three major points I want to deliver today. The first one is the inclusion of the persons affected by leprosy or Hansen disease in the disability sector. The state and all the key actors, I think, they must recognize the leprosy as disabilities issues, and the persons affected by leprosy should be allowed to participate into all the process to formulate the policies. That is the first point. And the second point is the effective participation. Participation is very much important, but participation should not be the goal. The more important thing is that what do you want to achieve as a result of the participation? So which means that participation should be a mean to achieve something. So in that aspect, the Sasakawa Health Foundation has been supporting the organization of the persons affected by leprosy since 1990s. And we have already supported 37 organizations from 23 countries. And the promoting the effective participation is one of the major area to support. And let me introduce you the good practice of some of the organizations. The first one is from India, the Association of the Persons Affected by Leprosy. They have succeeded to convince the state governments to establish special pension or allowance scheme exclusively for the persons affected by leprosy. And there are, of course, a number of the factors why they could be successful. But I think the most important point is that the ABLE was very clear about their advocacy strategies, meaning that they are clear to whom, for what issues, how, in what timing they are going to conduct their advocacy, aside from just participating into the dialogue. The second example is from Ethiopia. Ethiopian National Association of Persons Affected by Leprosy. ENAPAL has been involving into the various dialogue with the government. And one of the achievements is that they have succeeded to convince the government to provide a land with free of charge. And ENAPAL has decided to construct the office building. And also, they have decided to rent out some of the spaces for income generating, which means that by acquiring the income, they can ensure the organization sustainability. And Sasakawa Health Foundation has supported to construct their building. And according to them, the building is almost complete, and ENAPAL is planning to organize inauguration ceremonies in the end of August. And they are planning to invite the national authorities of Ethiopian government. And we believe that this income generating model initiated by ENAPAL can be a model for other organizations with persons affected by leprosy, succeeded to convince the government through the participation. So participation is very important, but should not be the goal. Participation should be the mean to achieve something. And my third point is the response to the climate change. In my observation, the leprosy communities has not fully examined the impact of climate change to the persons affected by leprosy. And we do not sure what kind of policies and support are needed to respond to the situation. So I think this is a very important issue for the whole the leprosy communities to explore how we are going to respond to this situation. And finally, I want to stress that the leprosy, as you know, or Hansen disease, is one of the oldest infectious disease, and the persons affected by leprosy has been suffering from stigma and discrimination from the society throughout almost a history of humankind. So I think, eliminating the stigma and discrimination should be a common goal for we human beings. And we can also learn so much from our experiences to deal with leprosy. The COVID-19 pandemic can be definitely one of the examples to respond to the COVID. And last but not least, given that the persons affected by leprosy or Hansen disease belongs to the one of the most vulnerable communities, eliminating the stigma and discrimination definitely align with the vision of Sustainable Development Goals, which is no one left behind. So I believe that all the players, government, NGOs, research institutes, foundations, we all should work together in a partnership. Our foundation, Sasakawa Health Foundation, is ready to play a more proactive role at that process. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nandri. I also appreciate your supporting and keeping your remarks brief. I would now like to call upon Dr. Nazmul Bari to please share his insights. Dr. Bari, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for introducing me. I'm the director of Center for Disability and Development. We are working since 1996 for the inclusion of persons with disabilities in development. Now, when you hear the name of the country, Bangladesh, it comes into mind the different hazards, disasters like floods and cyclones, and the negative impact of climate change. And we also have a refugee crisis. And we have heard that, persons with disabilities are disproportionately more affected, and within this group than the people with the invisible disabilities, with psychosocial disabilities, people with leprosy, the neglected disabilities are even more impacted. So one of the major area of our work is inclusive DRR, humanitarian crisis, and climate change. So I will share some of my organizational experience and learning from this work. When we start to work on these aspects, it is absolutely essential, as we have heard from other respected speakers, to understand the voices of persons with disabilities, persons with neglected disabilities, people with leprosy, the context where this is happening. What are the gaps? What are the needs? And how these gaps and needs can be addressed. We have to listen to them. We have to listen to them and listen to them and their representatives. And during this process, it is absolutely essential that we make sure that the most excluded, the people with invisible and neglected disabilities, are not left behind. Now, while working on these issues, we have come across different barriers. Let me just share a few. One of the biggest barriers we have faced is the lack of information, the disability disaggregated data, the impact of disaster, impact of climate change on invisible and neglected disabilities, as my previous speaker had mentioned, on people with leprosy. We need to understand this more. This lack of awareness is there, which acts as a huge barrier. This stigma and fear about people with leprosy, which needs to be addressed and removed. What we have also seen and experienced, there's a limited mobilization of people with disabilities. Their representation is few. So their leadership and voice, and it is essential that it is not just for the sake of participation, that it is meaningful and contributive. Then we have discussed also about the limited access to early detection, treatment, rehabilitation services, which we see as an organization essential for the inclusion of persons with disabilities, people with the leprosy. And during COVID-19, this was severely impacted. Then we also face the additional barriers related to intersectionality. There's gender, there's issue of ethnicity. Then there's also the issue of poverty, which we have seen. Accessibility is also a huge barrier, whether it is built infrastructure, cyclone shelters, wash points, transportation, communication, early warning, technology, all of those aspects. And protection is also a huge concern that we need to address. And one of the major gaps that we have seen is that, this understanding on how to include people with disabilities into. So mainstream actors, they are in need of these technical support. Okay, so there might be some guidelines and tools, but it's not only enough, whether these are being accessed and considered. Now, when we move towards an inclusive climate change action and disaster risk reduction, as I have earlier said, this increased awareness is very much required, and understanding, so that we can battle the stigma that is there about these invisible and neglected disabilities. I think there's still very little understanding about leprosy, the challenges there about the inclusion. Yes, we have to see it and understand it from the rights of as persons with disabilities. We need to shift this mentality from charity to right-based and recognizing the potential of persons with disabilities, people with leprosy, and that, yes, they can and they've done contributions, and there are examples in DRR and climate change adaptation. And also to understand about the self-stigma. The mobilization and strengthening of their organizations is very much important. And when we talk about organizations of persons with disabilities, we also need to see whether people with leprosy are also member of this, and so that there's a voice for everyone. The capacity strengthening of the mainstream actors and all stakeholders is very, very important. With respect to time, I'd like to conclude by highlighting a few major points. That we need to understand the barriers to inclusion. We need to understand what are the enablers, and then to plan our actions accordingly. As said before, I would repeat it again, this awareness to address stigma, fear, the right kind of understanding. We need more studies and research which will give us valuable input. The mobilization and capacity strengthening of persons with invisible and neglected disabilities. Their meaningful participation, meaningful contribution, and decision-making process. The disaggregated data is very important. We also can't forget the individual and specific needs of people with disabilities in disaster situation, in climate change risks. One side, it does not fit all. We need to think of everyone. We need to really invest in DIDRR, Disability Includes Climate Change. Finally, I think there are champions of inclusion from the invisible and neglected disability sector. We really need to promote and support them. And yes, I think if we are all together on this, if we raise our voice collectively, if we work together in partnership, I think we can really contribute towards a more inclusive society, which is also truly inclusive for people with neglected disabilities, people with leprosy, people with invisible disabilities, as we are suggesting. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Bari. Really great to hear about your work. And thank you for emphasizing the need for participatory approach. Unfortunately, due to paucity of time, we are not able to take up questions from the audience, but we are monitoring the chat box and Q&A windows and taking notes of all the comments and the questions that are coming in. We have also received several questions for our sessions through the registration form. I will ask my team to also drop our email ID, secretariat.dpi@gmail.com, in the chat box. Coming to the end of the session, I would like to call upon His Excellency Mr. Kimaru Tetsuya, Ambassador at the Permanent Mission of the Japan to the United Nations, to deliver the closing remarks for the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Shukla. And dear distinguished panelists, participants, dear colleagues, it is an honor for me to co-host this event on the margin of the Conference of the State Parties to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, together with Disabled People's International, the Sakawa Health Foundation, the Center for Disability in Development, and the National Center for Promotion of Employment for Persons with Disabilities. I would first like to express my sincere appreciation to all of the distinguished speakers for today's discussion. I hope that their voices will help renew commitments to fighting discrimination against persons affected by leprosy. Persons affected by leprosy have long been excluded from society. Regrettably, my own country of Japan had implemented an isolation policy until the 1990s. However, the government officially apologized, and today it has been making the utmost effort to eliminate discrimination against them and restore their honor as well as their social lives. In the international arena, Japan, together with other countries, led the adoption of the resolution on the elimination of discrimination against persons affected by leprosy and their family members by consensus at the Human Rights Council in 2020, whose mandate was based on the resolution, highlighted the disproportionate impact brought by COVID-19 on persons affected by leprosy. It echoes with the concept of today's event that the rights of the most vulnerable persons tend to be neglected in emergencies, and that is important to further increase their visibility in society, as well as to include them in policy-making discussions and their implementation. Together with its partners, we'll continue its effort to advance the rights of persons affected by leprosy and their participation as equal members of society. We encourage other delegations and the relevant stakeholders to do the same. I would like to conclude my remarks with my sincere thanks to Disabled People's International and Sasakawa Health Foundation for organizing this important event. Congratulations on the successful and fruitful discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the closing remark. We are grateful to you for your continued support and for institutionalizing the principle of leave no one behind. We are grateful to you and the government of Japan. Finally, I want to thank all our speakers, Dr. Floyd Morris, Dr. Alice Cruz, for such powerful messages, Subodha and Dinesh for touching experiences, and our panelists, Dr. Mahapatra, Ipul, Dr. Nandri, Mr. Bari, for such engaging and knowledge-packed remarks and insights and personal experiences. Key takeaways from this session will support our future work on advancing the rights of persons affected by leprosy. With this, it's a wrap. Thank you once again to all our dignitaries, panelists, and our wonderful participants.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye. Have a nice day.
Bye-bye. Have a good